Hello and welcome, everyone. We're very glad to have you here. My name is William Roca. I'm the Director of Programs here at Village Preservation. Before we get started this evening, first, I would like to thank our co-sponsors for this event this evening, Merchants House Museum and the Salmagundi Club. If you're unfamiliar with them, please go over and check out their websites and see all of the wonderful work that they do. They are really great institutions and partners. So please go and check out all of the wonderful programs and other things that they do as well. So this evening's program is 1830s New York City, a decade of social, political, and geographical upheaval with James Scully. Just some Zoom protocol. Please, if you have questions at any point during the presentation for James this evening, don't hesitate. Go ahead and drop those at the Q&A feature that you should see at the bottom of your screen there. Just click that button and type those questions in, and I'll be asking those questions on your behalf to James at the end of tonight's presentation. Now, if you're unfamiliar with village preservation, we've been around since 1980. And we work to document, celebrate, and preserve the special architectural and cultural heritage of Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo. We've secured landmark designation for over 1,250 buildings in our neighborhoods, and we host over 75 free programs like this throughout the year. And so that's why your support is incredibly important to help us keep these programs free and to help the work that we do. You see the QR code there on your screen. Please go ahead and scan that and consider becoming a member or donating. And you'll also be able to learn more about the programs and all of the wonderful work and resources available on our website, villagepreservation.org. Just to give you an upcoming program on Wednesday, May 29th at 6 p.m., we have historian, artist, and activist Jonathan Ned Katz in conversation. He'll be speaking with our executive director, Andrew Berman. He just completed an oral history with us and will be speaking about his book that he wrote and all of the wonderful memories that he has. But now to introduce this evening's guest, James Scully. He is a native New Yorker who grew up in a home with 3 generations of family, close relationships with both his grandparents and great-grandparents, and was exposed to an invaluable amount of local culture. It's helped him become a passionate actor, writer, director, and historian. He's a graduate of Xavier High School in Manhattan and Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, and has spent over a decade working for media companies such as Condé Nast and Hearst. And he is the creator of Breaking Walls, a docu-podcast on the history of American network radio broadcasting. He's directed, post-produced, adapted, and acted in scripted audio fiction production, and is an actor in the Fireside Mystery Theatre troupe. He's also a Salmagundi Club member, New York City tour guide, and the director and co-director of the award-winning historical audio fiction soap opera, Burning Gotham. Welcome, James. It's great to have you here.
Thank you.
So I am going to stop my share. I'm going to disappear into the shadows and hand it over to you.
Thank you very much. I'll share my screen. And the first thing I want to do is bring up my presentation for the evening. Well, William gave me that rousing introduction. And I guess I don't have to explain to you how I could come to be doing this episode or this presentation tonight. So let's get right into it then. So you've seen this, just so you know, Burning Gotham. Burning Gotham is set in 1835 New York City. It's a historical fiction audio soap opera that I spent 4 years developing and researching with my writing partner and friend, Miss Olga Lysenko. And it was a 2022 Tribeca Film Festival audio selection. I self-produced the first 8 episodes to get into that festival. Now, through that, I got my New York City tour guide license, and I've started doing webinars of this time. Suffice to say that I'm not a historian by trade. I'm actually my training in college was in graphic design and advertising. I spent more than 10 years as an art director and copywriter, and have since branched out into the world of audio production. And I do a monthly docu-podcast, as you heard, on the history of American network radio broadcasting. It's called Breaking Walls. It's done in sort of a Ken Burns style. And through that, I started developing new fiction productions. But I became a New York City historian unwittingly, because this period in New York history, the 1830s, is this wild and forgotten era of New York history. So let's get right into it. Excuse me, seasonal allergies. Have you heard of Moving Day? Well, May 1st, 1835 was a cold and rainy moving day. Now, if you haven't heard of Moving Day, you should know that what starts as tradition in British New York becomes a law in the early 19th century, which lasts on the books till Fiorello LaGuardia is the mayor. All rental leases, unless you sign an extension ahead of time, but all rental leases in New York City simultaneously expired May 1st, 9 a.m., regardless of the day of the week. And I think maybe if it was a Sunday, that would have been different. But other than that, May 1st, 9 a.m., all the renters' leases simultaneously expire. That is an absurd concept that I don't know anybody who can wrap their head around why this would have still been going on deep into the 19th century. In fact, Frances Trollope, a famed diarist of note, and the term trollop comes from, she wrote that more than one of her New York friends had bought or built houses solely to avoid this annual inconvenience. So if you want to know a little bit about the Burning Gotham part, which I'll just tell you really quickly, so Burning Gotham is an ensemble cast audio soap opera. It's kind of like Deadwood on HBO meets Dallas. The main character is Aaron Burr's illegitimate son, at least in the first 8 episodes. 1835 New York City is a city of roughly 270,000 people, mostly living below 14th Street. It's kind of like Deadwood in the sense that there's relative lawlessness. You still have no real organized police force. You have a volunteer firefighting force. You have no clean running water. And, we're talking a city where that's like 5 times the amount of people that could fit into a football stadium. So in this case, in Burning Gotham, and we're going to get into the real history really quickly, but I just want to lay some of this out. So New York, 1835, it's 10 years since the completion of the Erie Canal. Most people live in wooden or brick buildings, no taller than 5 stories, but construction is booming. As you might have known, if you know anything about New York history, they say that New York in the 19th century is one giant construction site. And that's not just the buildings going up, that's the streets literally being carved through the landscape. The gap between rich and poor is rapidly expanding as we head towards the Gilded Age, and thousands of people stream onto New York's dangerously overcrowded streets. Many come to earn an honest living, others for more nefarious reasons. And it's here where that story begins. So in this particular case, our main character, Aaron Columbus, he's an illegitimate son of Aaron Burr, desperate to make his fortune, so he struck an illegal import deal with John Jacob Aster, the richest man in America, to import 2 exiled Russian countesses, Serena and Raiza Zuboff, and their inheritance, 11 pounds of uncut diamonds. Together with Aaron's surrogate brother, Wyndham Bowen, an African man born in Europe, they involved themselves in backroom deals, abolitionism, potential war with France, and city politics. Their actions will engulf New York's very unstable economy. All right, that's just to set some of the stage as far as how I even got into knowing some of these things about what was going on in the history of New York at this time and how to dramatize something like that. The rest of what I'm going to tell you today, it's all factual stuff. Let's go over federal oversight first, because if you want to understand anything about New York in 1835, we've got to start with the United States of America. And this is an important period in our history as a country because we're still grappling with, and we see this today, will we be the United States of America or the United States of America, aka what will have more power, federal or state government? And I really think now, while we still grapple with that today, but that's something that is really top of mind until after the Civil War. Really, that's a big part of the Civil War in that sense, in some ways. Andrew Jackson is the president of the United States in 1835. He's the 7th president. He's in the middle of his 2nd term. On New Year's Day that year, he pays off the entire national debt. It's the only time in U.S. history that's ever been accomplished, and he survives an assassination attempt, the first in our country's history, later that month. So we're also in the era of the Second National Bank of the United States of America. The first national bank established by Alexander Hamilton, that charter, long gone. Second National Bank is basically headquartered in Philadelphia because we're still at a point in our nation's history where New York, Philadelphia, and Boston are still somewhat grappling over who will be the city that will rival at some point London and Paris and all of the great European cities. It's going to be New York. We know that now, but it was somewhat kind of, you could figure it out then as well. That's all to say that the Second National Bank's main branch was in Philadelphia. And that bank's head, Nicholas Biddle, gets into a beef basically with Andrew Jackson. And so Jackson says to him, okay, I'll tell you what, you know, your charter that's coming up for renewal in 1836, well, guess what? I'm vetoing it. And he does. So as of 1836 in the United States of America, there will be no federally backed currency in the whole country. That's insane. I mean, think about it. Like, who, if you have Chase Bank or Citibank or Citizens Bank, your banks would be printing their own money, and it might have a different value to your blacksmith might say that your Chase dollars have a different value than Citibank dollars. So this is causing helping to cause, I should say, wild inflation and honestly financial chaos. It's part of why the whole economy nationally could collapse. Now, as far as that federal money and these federal banks, Jackson takes all of that money out of those federal banks and starts dumping them into these state banks. He was not a big fan of the federal currency. Now, at the same time, as all of this is happening, the U.S. is on the verge of war with France. This is because of unpaid debts from Napoleonic high seas conquests. We don't think of our country as being on the verge of war with France when 10 years earlier, Marquis de Lafayette was being paraded around the nation as one of the last remaining United States, or not, one of the last remaining American Revolutionary War heroes. But basically what happens is when Napoleon is waging wars, he's, taking, it's high seas conquests. And he's long gone, obviously, by 1835. But the French king, it's the era of the Second Monarchy, the French king Louis Philippe. Well, the French government, they pay back their debts with England, and they paid back their debts with Spain, and they paid back their debts with Portugal. And they essentially tell the United States, what are you going to do about it? You're across the Atlantic Ocean. We're not going to pay you. So Jackson, who is as polarizing to his people then as he is to us today, he goes to his Congress, which he's not getting along with, and he basically says, we have to go to war. And they say, no, we're not going to war. And he says, but, whether you like Jackson or not, you can see his point here when he says, if we don't declare war on France right now, who will ever pay us back anything they ever owe us? They're going to consider us to be a paper government that they can just run roughshod over, which he's a man who is used to running roughshod over other people. So I think he has an idea as to why this is potentially a bad idea. Now, would a war with France been a good idea? Probably not. So our minister to France at the time is a man named Edward Livingston. And he is called back to the United States. And he arrives back in New York, because he's a New Yorker, in June of 1835 aboard the USS Constitution, which is a ship docked in Boston Harbor today. And the same day that he arrives back, and we're going to get into some things like this in a few minutes, a riot breaks out that has nothing to do with him in 5 Points between nativists and Catholics. So that's the kind of place New York is at that time. But back to France for a second. This issue with France becomes an international stalemate that hurts international trade. Now, at the same time, Jackson's port collector is a man named Samuel Swartwout. Martin Van Buren is the vice president at this point. And Van Buren, by the way, is a Tammany Hall Grand Sachem. Tammany Hall already in power in New York. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes. But Van Buren goes to Jackson when Jackson is about to appoint Swartwout. And he says, do not appoint this man. He is much too corrupt. Essentially, I think we can agree that most politicians can be a little shady. But there's a difference between being a little bit shady and being really brazen about it and out in the open. And actually, when Jackson leaves office and Van Buren becomes president, one of the first things that Van Buren does is prosecute Samuel Swartwout for embezzlement, because he was embezzling millions of dollars. Anyway, one more thing about federal oversight, because here comes Jackson again, who kills the Second National Bank, right? Well, on July 11th, 1836, his last year as the president of the United States, he issues the specie circular, forcing large acre and or high dollar land investments, and really anything of high dollar. I forget the actual amount, but anything, we'll just say whatever the number is, it's relatively high, but not as high as you would think. Imagine in our currency today, if anything over $100,000, right? Let's just go back to what this is for a second. It has to be paid for using gold or silver. So he devalues the currency of the United States by killing the federal, Second National Bank, dumps all this money into state banks who are printing their own money, i.e. paper money, and then he turns around a year later and says, oh, and that paper money is now totally valueless. So that immediately causes the Panic of 1837 as he leaves office, destroys Martin Van Buren's presidency, but before it even really begins. As an aside, New York's Second National Bank branch building was architected by Martin Euclid Thompson in the Greek Revival style and erected next door to Federal Hall on the north side of Wall Street between Nassau and William Street in 1825, the same year the Erie Canal opened. And you can see at the top there in this black and white photo from the turn of the 20th century, there's the Federal Hall that we've come to know and love, and next door is the bank branch of the Second National Bank. Now that facade is saved. It is it's in the atrium of the American Wing at the Met Museum. There it is in the lower photo. That's my photo down there that I've snapped. Always loved that facade. I think it's beautiful, long before I knew anything about anything to do with this period. So it was installed there in 1924 and eventually enclosed as the Met grew in time. And if you can hear horns, I'm sorry, it's New York. How fitting. So let's go over some of the elements, right, about what makes New York at this time. Now, that was just federal stuff, but you can imagine immediately how that would affect any economy, state, city, etc., all over the country. So I mentioned this at the onset. There's no clean drinking water in New York in 1835 in a city of almost 270,000 people. Access to clean drinking water is relegated to the rich, i.e., wealthy people have their water shipped in, and they called them hogsheads at the time, water barrels, basically, having them shipped in ahead of time. The city water that, and at this point, I should say city equals, technically, in 1835, the city council, which is called the Common Council at the time, decreed that all land up to 42nd Street all streets shall be now opened and thus far considered part of New York City. But really, the city stretches to roughly around Union Square at the time. So if you're wealthy, you have your water shipped in, right? What happens if you're poor? Well, you drink rancid water. This issue is partly behind yellow fever epidemics in the 1820s and cholera epidemics in the 1830s, along with overcrowded streets and poor knowledge of, hygiene and the medical practices that we know today. So we need clean water, right? Well, there's two elections at the time, one in April and one in November. We obviously still have November elections now. But in April of 1835, New Yorkers vote to build the Croton Aqueduct. There's the exact numbers, 17,000 some odd vote yes, a little less than 6,000 vote no. Some people who were against it liked the New York water. They felt it gave the city character, whatever. People are ridiculous at times. So who's going to pay for this water, this damned water? Who's going to pay for it? Well, the people will pay for it. Tammany Hall Democrats are in power, and the Croton Aqueduct will be paid for through stocks and bonds totaling, it's actually $2.5 million. Basically, there's a down payment due September 1st, 1835 of $1 million. There's a down payment due January 1st, 1836 of $1 million. And there's a final payment due April 1st, 1836 of $500,000. Why? Well, it's interesting. Let's go to Tammany Hall for a second. The mayor at the time is a man named Cornelius Lawrence. The Lawrence family still has they've got burial plots, and they're a prominent Queens family. They had lots of land. Their country estate was out in Queens. Mayor Lawrence is the first popularly elected mayor in city history in 1834. Prior to him, all mayors were appointed. And at this time, they're serving one-year terms. And actually, the two parties that you should think of that are competing with each other in 1835 are the Democrats, run in this case by the Tammany Hall political machine, which is emerging, and the Whigs, which are, you could also say are the know-nothings, the nativists. Those are basically Whigs, usually. Now, if we're going to think about Tammany Hall for a second, we should think of it in three ways. Tammany Hall originally was the Tammany Society, which people of all different kinds of political backgrounds belonged to, whether they be Democratic, Republicans, Federalists, Whigs, etc. It started in the late 1700s. Aaron Burr was a member. Martin Van Buren was a member. In fact, he was a Grand Sachem. So just remember that when he gets elected and becomes president of the United States in 1837, Tammany Hall is in the White House. By this time, there's another way you could think of a Tammany Hall, and that would be the hall itself that they would rent out, like a Knights of Columbus Hall or something like that, this physical space. And then there's the emerging political machine that winds up becoming the driving force behind the Democratic Party for the rest of the century into the era of Al Smith, basically. But at this point, when they are so much in power that in the April 1835 elections, the same ones where New Yorkers vote to build this Croton Aqueduct, the Whigs have been trounced so badly in the 1834 elections that they don't bother to run a candidate against Lawrence. They let him run unopposed. And essentially they lick their wounds and say, we'll come back stronger. And they do. But in the meantime, I think I'm going to talk a little bit more and like, why would the city itself not pay for the Croton Aqueduct? Why would it be offered for stocks and bonds, basically? Why would it be? But let's go back for a second to something else. John Jacob Aster, you see him here, the richest man in America. He's a New Yorker at this time. He's been in New York for quite some time. And Eliza Jamel, the richest woman in America, the first woman with power of attorney over her own estate. Her house, I'm sure many of you know who are tuning in, is still here today, the Morris Jamel Mansion up in Washington Heights. Well, they believe that one man is capable of getting this Croton project off the ground. He's a man obsessed with water and fire, and he's pretty much a forgotten man. His name is Stepan Allen. He's a Tammany Democrat with a penchant for control. In fact, he's such a powerful Democrat in Tammany's machine here that in the May 1835 Democrat National Convention in Baltimore, he's Tammany's representative. So that tells you how powerful he was. He's a former mayor of New York, a former state assemblyman, and we're going to get it. All three of these people, we're going to talk more about them in depth in a little while, as in next. So let's go with Eliza for a second. Fascinating woman. She's the richest woman in America in the 1830s, the first woman with power of attorney over her own estate. Essentially, and I want to make sure I get this history right off the top of my head, but Eliza, we're not going to get into how she became married to Stephen Jamel. Did she trick him into this marriage, etc.? What was her background? We know she at some point lived in a brothel as a child. Was she at some point a courtesan? Let's not get into that. If she wasn't, and history remembers her as being that, it's because she was unpopular with older money people who didn't like that she had more wealth than them, so they spread these rumors because they did not want her to be a part of their society. But she has power of attorney over her own estate because she's living with her husband, Stephen, in France. He's a wealthy merchant. He has business interests in New York, in Paris, etc. And when Napoleon is ousted from power, she rides a carriage through the streets of France with Napoleon's flag flying on both sides of the carriage, cursing the people for allowing this to happen. So they basically throw her out. I'm sure if she was anybody else, she would have been thrown right in jail, right? But because she's a powerful merchant's wife, they throw her out of the country altogether. She comes back to New York, and in the ensuing years, she essentially takes Stephen's business here, his interests, and grows them exponentially. When he dies, she spends the rest of her life fighting his French family for control over her, the business, basically. They don't believe her family, well, her in-laws, I should say, don't believe that this woman should ever be able to run the business. But she basically goes to the powerful men at the time and says, would you rather do business with me, who you've been doing business with anyway, or would you rather do business with these strangers from France that you don't know what they're going to do one way or another? So they say, no, we do want to keep doing business with you. It makes sense for all of us involved. And so she becomes the first woman with power of attorney over her estate because of that. Now, She holds numerous properties around New York City, including the aforementioned mansion, and she has a keen interest in the Croton project because, and if you know where the mansion is, it's like right where Coogan's Bluff is, which, you know, in the next century would have, you know, which where the Polo Grounds, New York Giants baseball stadium would be below that if you were, you know, but she has an interest because she believes that the Croton Reservoir is going to flow past her house, therefore making her land even more valuable. Will that happen? That remains to be seen. But now she has a relationship with Aaron Burr, the Aaron Burr, sir, who by 1833 is a much older man. There seemed to have been some sort of relationship that they had in their youth, younger, and you know, she is 60 years old in 1835, but looks much younger. At one time, is considered the most beautiful woman in New York, but there's a lot of women who rightfully hold claim to that, you know, that title. But there seemed to have been some sort of flirtation between the two of them, if not more, in the past. Now, she thinks marrying him will increase her standing in the community because of his last name, basically. He thinks marrying her, because he's flat broke secretly, well, not so secretly, I think pretty much everybody knows that by then, will give him access to means that he doesn't have. So on July 1st, 1833, they are wed in a tiny midnight ceremony at the Marshmallow Mansion in the you know, I guess you'd call it vestibule or foyer. The ceremony is followed by a formal dinner for 8. Now, she soon finds him to be both unfaithful and either poorly investing her money or embezzling it. She files for divorce. This is actually incorrect. It's July 11th, 1834. And it's the 30th anniversary of the duel with Burr, not the 29th. And as part of her legal eagle team, among the divorce helpers is attorney Alexander Hamilton Jr., who she sends to serve Burr with the papers on the 30th anniversary of the day he killed Alexander Hamilton Jr.'s father. So, you know, I think if in 100 years they found all of our William and my professional emails, they would have an idea of us that would be slightly more formal than we actually are. You know, the way William is going to speak, and I don't mean to bring you up, William, but the way William would speak professionally is not how he's going to speak with his, you know, his family at Christmas dinner or Hanukkah dinner or Thanksgiving or something. You know, it's more informal, it's familial. So I always like to bring this moment up of her officially serving him with divorce papers on the 30th anniversary of the duel, because if you ever want to think, are people 180 years ago, which we were talking about 16 generations ago at this point, the same as we are today? Yes, and here's an example. What a woman. So that's Eliza. Now, John Jacob Aster, he's born in 1763 in Waldorf. He migrates to the United States in 1783, eventually making his fortune in the fur trade. Beaver. Lewis and Clark get to the West Coast in the first decade of the 19th century, 1805. And for the next 20 years before the Erie Canal really opens, and for those who aren't totally conscious of this, the Erie Canal, paid for with private funding, basically spearheaded by DeWitt Clinton, governor of New York, connects the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean, opening up the interior of the country for settlement, allowing all of that to flow through New York State, and therefore New York City, the greatest port in the Western world. Prior to that, the 20 years in between, the one generation, who's out there besides Native Americans? Basically fur trappers, men wading in waist-deep freezing water to collect things like beaver pelts for this man, John Jacob Astor. But by 1835, beaver's on its way out. And if you think of like Astoria, Oregon, right? Well, if you're in New York and it's 1835, what do you really know of what's going on 3,000 miles away? It's a very difficult empire to keep a thumb on. So he divests himself completely from the fur trade that year. And he puts his focus on two things. One, building the greatest hotel in North America on the western side of City Hall Park, the north side of VC Street, directly across the street from St. Paul's Chapel. This becomes the Aster House. You know, it was the official name was the Park Hotel, colloquially known as the Aster House. And also sinking his money into New York real estate. And a famous quote of his, the first 100,000, that was the hardest to get, but afterwards, it was easy to make more. And so this is that hotel. And if you can see in the bottom left-hand portion of the screen, that is the gates around St. Paul's Chapel. This is in the 1890s, by the way. Now, And this is another side of it. This is the other side of 1892 Park Row. Now, the hotel is actually demolished in two sections. This southern section of it, an office building goes up called the Park Office Building. I think it's what it's called. And it emulates purposely, and I'll click back to this for a second, the construction of the Aster House. So if you go there today and walk along the northern side here of VC Street, along by St. Paul's Chapel, and look up at this building at the corner, you'll notice that it kind of looks very similar to the Aster House. And obviously at this time, you figure this is a 5 or 6 or 7 story building. That's about as big as you can make something at the time. Well, we couldn't build up just yet, so we built sprawling large buildings, and this has a tremendous footprint. And then there's the forgotten man, Stepan Allen. Stepan Allen is orphaned by the death of his parents during the Revolutionary War. He makes his fortune as a sailmaker and an entrepreneur. He's the 55th mayor of New York City in the 1820s, a member of the New York State Assembly, and a state senator. He moves to 1 Washington Square North in 1835. That building is still there. Pretty sure it's owned by NYU today. And he leads the commission that very quickly rebuilds New York's commercial center after the Great Fire. We're going to get more into that in a little while. This is something he writes in his diary in December of 1835. The work is now progressing with all the speed that a project of so much importance and magnitude will warrant. And we entertain no doubt whatever, if our lives are spared, that we shall be enabled to complete what we have undertaken to the perfect satisfaction of our fellow citizens. Now, obviously, this is the Greenwich Village Historical Preservation Society, and I think we understand that Greenwich Village is very much around in 1835. By this point, it's essentially being connected to New York City proper, and several of the streets that many of them are already here. And what affects downtown affects Greenwich Village. Like fires, for example. They're a major problem in a city. Now, there are hydrants and there are reservoirs for fighting fires at this point. They're not nearly as advanced as they would get in the coming decades. Now, I mentioned this man for a second, Stepan Allen. He's a Tammany Democrat, right? He's the Tammany's representative at the 1835 Democrat National Convention. That's how powerful he is. He's the head of the Croton Project. He's named the head of the Croton Project in May of 1835, right before he leaves to go to this Democrat National Convention. The month before that, he's named the head of the Water and Fire Commission. So that's, I mentioned fires are a major problem. Well, let's talk about this one particular fire for a second. August 12th, 1835 at 2 a.m., a fire breaks out at 115 Fulton Street. This fire is colloquially known today as the Ann Street Fire. The fire destroys everything in 10 or 12 buildings on the east side, blah, 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 blah. The most important part, besides the fact that this is a bad fire, is that the New York Morning Herald's office is destroyed. It was the second penny paper ever formed. We're going to talk about it in a little while. That's run by James Gordon Bennett, Sr. 5 people die in this fire. Now, less than a month later, Mayor Lawrence, Tammany Democrat, charges to the Common Council, the name of the city council at the time, that he feels the recent fires are incendiary in origin, and he offers a reward of $500, which is, this even factoring in more inflation is roughly $20K today to anybody who has any information. Not more than 2 weeks after this fire, another bad fire breaks out at Franklin and Chapel Streets, College Place today. So fires are a major, major, major problem in the 1830s. And we could talk about that for a second because we're coming out of the era of wooden buildings. I'm not an architectural historian, but we've moved beyond the Federalist architecture in past Georgian architecture, and now we're in the Greek Revival age. But that area downtown, today's financial district, is already totally built up by then, long since built up. And it's very, very difficult to get anything done down there because terms like gridlock already exist. Things are right on top of each other. In fact, for those who don't know, and if you know Greenwich Village's history and the history of the Hangman's Elm in Washington Square Park, you'll know that arson is a capital crime because it's a very dangerous thing to have happen in this city. Now, I mentioned James Gordon Bennett, right? Well, while all of this is happening in New York, and everything, by the way, that I've said to you right now is all happening in 1835, 1 year. Cholera, the disease, and fire fears are stirred by the city's penny papers. There's the New York Sun with the man in the stovepipe hat at the top. That's Benjamin Day. He forms the New York Sun in 1832, the first penny paper. Smaller print, smaller, like it's not a big broadsheet, it's a smaller sheet. He sees that even the most quote unquote wretched poor people at least have a penny to spend. And the papers prior to that, say like the Courier and Inquirer and papers like that were 6-cent papers, they are more interested in things like shipping notices and stuff that would be for the merchant class and the upper class. But Day understands that that's not what the majority of the new citizens of New York are interested in. They want to know the sensationalist details, the gossip, the fear-mongering, all of this kinds of stuff that we still know today is to be, at best, yellow journalism. Well, so on May 1st, 1835, that same moving day, right? James Gordon Bennett Sr., the man on the right, founds the New York Morning Herald. He first publishes May 6th. They're battling for readership. Nobody likes Bennett Sr. He's unpleasant, he's shrewd, he'll do anything to make the Herald the world's most popular paper. So, Benjamin Day hires a new editor, a man named Richard Adams Locke. Getting into why he needs a new editor is a whole other side story that will run out of time. But suffice to say, a stabbing at the Elysian Fields has something to do with it if you'd like to look up more information. The Elysian Fields in New Jersey. So this man Locke has known to have ghost authored a recent disruptive play called Matthias the Prophet. Another whole side story, not worth getting into at the moment. In August, their battle leads to the greatest literary hoax of the 19th century. So, while this fire, August 12th, happens, it knocks Gordon Bennett Sr. out of being able to publish for a few weeks. He winds up returning, and the New York Morning Herald is rebranded as the New York Herald, which we know it as today. While he can't publish, Richard Adams Locke and Benjamin Day concoct a story that's known to today as the greatest literary hoax of the 19th century, the Great Moon Hoax. And it starts as a little notice in the paper of essentially along the lines of interesting development happening in Scotland right now. Keep in mind, Halley's Comet is flying overhead in September of 1835. There's a telescope that they install in City Hall Park that for 6 cents you can view. If you want to do the conversion rate, it's roughly like $2.50 today. This little notice in the New York Sun slowly over the course of a week branches out into this great big story about intelligent life in the form of man-bats walking on the moon, and upright man-bats, basically winged, creatures that have, intelligence. And the papers sell like hotcakes. They print a pamphlet of just the moon hoax, which is not being called the moon hoax, obviously. And those sell like hotcakes. And the Sun makes a killing while the Herald can't publish. Now, I'm not suggesting that the New York Sun had anything to do with the fire that destroyed the Herald's office. It's more like taking advantage of a situation. Also, May 1st, 1835, this man, P.T. Barnum, who was much younger in 1835, on May 1st, moves to New York from Connecticut. So even he does it to start a grocer. Barnum is already interested. He at this point has already run a paper in Connecticut. He's made money and lost money. And he's not interested in running a grocery. Well, a few months later, an acquaintance of his from Philadelphia, or who has just been in Philadelphia, comes to his shop. And he says something along the lines of, I just saw the darndest thing in Philadelphia. There's a woman there, an African-American woman who's paralyzed from the waist down, only has use of one arm, and is blind. And she is claiming to be the 161-year-old nursemaid to George Washington. This catches Barnum's attention, which I think we can see why it would. And he goes to see this woman, whose name is Joyce Head. And this is not covered in the biopic of Barnum at all. And I think if you look at Barnum and then you see a photo of Hugh Jackman, that was very Ambitious casting, physically speaking. Well, it's not covered because Barnum essentially buys this woman. And I think that's why it's not covered, because while slavery was outlawed in New York in 1827, I don't know that he necessarily treats her like a slave. I can't say that Joyce has much agency over her own life at the same time. So Barnum exhibits her at Niblow's garden. And actually earlier that year, he goes to William Niblow, and Niblow's garden is, it's a pleasure garden where you might get a cocktail, you might get some ice cream. It's located on the eastern side of Broadway, south of just between Prince and Houston Street. Oddly enough, on the western side of that same street, directly across the street, John Jacob Aster has built himself a one-story office where, you know, there's bars in the window, etc. And I just bring that up because years later, not that many years later, Aster has his hotel on the western side of City Hall Park. Barnum opens up the American Museum on the eastern side of City Hall Park. But anyway, earlier that year, after May 1st, but before this happens in October, Barnum goes to William Niblow looking for a bartending job. He gets turned down. Niblow basically turns it down because he could tell, I don't think you're going to be in this for the long haul. You want to be in business for yourself. Barnum goes back to him and tells him the story of Joyce Heth, and Niblow agrees to exhibit her in a room there. And so she does. They work her like 5 to 6 days a week, and she's basically telling stories. And then they take her out on what is very much a proto-vaudeville circuit. She passes away early in 1836. I don't know so much from being overworked, because she was already supposed to be the 161-year-old nursemaid to George Washington. As is the day that we're living in then in 1836, Barnum holds a public autopsy. He sells tickets because we want to find out exactly how old this woman is, and they find her to be in her 80s. Pretty grotesque, to say the least. Not how old she was, but the public autopsy and selling tickets. But it would not have been considered in poor taste by the majority of citizens at the time. And that's how Barnum starts his career as a showman. It's not long after that he opens up the American Museum. So in regards to the New York Sun's hoax, Barnum calls it remarkable. He calls it a humbug, but it's not, and it's not nearly as remarkable as what happens in December. So now, remember I said, the Croton Aqueduct is going to cost $2.5 million. It's going to be paid for by the citizens of New York, stocks and bonds. They meet the first $1 million payment in September of 1835, September 1st. There's a $1 million payment due January 1st, 1836. Well, on December 7th, 1835, Common Council season document number 53, what happens here is, if you're a volunteer firefighter up until this moment in time, the fire bells sound off, right? Because fire's happening all the time. And you run to your firehouse, you collect the gear, and you go to fight the fire, much like you would expect. Well, they changed this on December 7th, 1835. The Committee of Police Watch and Prisons, convinced by the frequent occurrence of fires, thought that strong and effective police regulations should be maintained. They amend this law. It's now the duty of constables and marshals to report themselves to the mayor. Essentially, and if you think about the chiefs of each firehouse, right? So if you're now a fireman, this makes some sense if you think about it. You go and you don't just collect your gear and go to the fire. You wait for your word. You wait for word from the chief. And essentially, this ladders up where people have to wait for word, wait for word, wait for word. And who is the person making the ultimate decision? Mayor Cornelius Lawrence, the Tammany Democrat mayor. That's December 7th, 1835. 9 days later, New York City burns to the ground, or at least the financial district. On the frigid, blustery night of December 16th, 1835, the worst fire in city history sweeps through Manhattan. This is still a worse fire than on 9/11 in terms of area. Everything in the chief merchant district, what we know as the financial district today, which was already a financial district then, excuse me for just one second, my cat is clawing my furniture. Stop that. Sorry. Everything in the chief merchant district with the highest property value turns to ash. It causes the modern equivalent of $500 million in damage, and the investigation rules the cause to be accidental. My cat gets jealous if I'm not paying attention to her. So let's go over this one more time. On the frigid, blustery night of December 16th, 1835, the worst fire in city history sweeps through Manhattan. It starts in a warehouse called Comstock and Andrews. Comstock and Andrews is located just north of Hanover Square. It's right where the bar, the Killarney Rose, is today, or at least a little bit north of that. Interestingly enough, in the 1690s, guess who has a house on that spot? Captain William Kidd, the Captain Kidd, the pirate or privateer, however you want to call it. And this is not about anything, but throughout the 17 and 1800s, stories of Captain Kidd's buried treasure persisted all over the place. Well, by 1835, there's a fine dry goods warehouse there owned by two men named Comstock and Andrews. Now, this is a dry goods area, and they you know, it's also a very flammable area. So everything in this district burns. It causes the modern equivalent of $500 million in damage. Now, these three slides do not do this fire justice. I think, you know, the best telling of it, if you go listen to Greg Young and Tom Meyer's Bowery Boys episode on the Great Fire of 1835. Excuse me. Essentially, at roughly 9 o'clock, this is a Tuesday night, a watchman happens by the warehouse of Comstock and Andrews and notices it to be on fire. He goes to alert who he needs to alert. By the time he comes back, several buildings have caught fire. This is a night that is below zero with 40-mile-an-hour winds. And in 1835, not only do you have issues with international trade with France and issues with the currency of the United States about to no longer be federally backed, but it turns unseasonably cold early. By Halloween, the waters are freezing over, which is, even for that era, very unusual for it to be that early. So these firemen, when they need, and by the way, they're exhausted because there was a bad fire the night before that a lot of people died in on December 15th. So they're exhausted, right? It's 9 o'clock. They're rousing themselves out to put their gear on, and it's incredibly windy and dry. They have to rush to, say, the East River. And now keep in mind that the warehouse is on Pearl Street. Waterfront and South already built out by 1835. But they have to get to the East River and be chiseling down into the East River just to get to a weak stream of water to helplessly blow it at nothing, because what happens is this fire is spreading, and it's so windy that anything they can actually get out of their hand-cranked hoses blows right back in their face. The firemen are literally icicles, like covered in icicles. They take to pouring brandy in their boots to keep their boots from freezing over. A hopeless scenario. Now, if you're a merchant in the area, take two very prominent merchants whose off, you know, their warehouse is destroyed that night. Arthur and Lewis Tappan. They're also famous because in 1835, and we didn't even touch on this, but this is a whole other story, they flood the South with abolitionist papers because we're very much in the era of national abolitionism. It almost causes Andrew Jackson to literally shut down the U.S. Postal Service because of the amount of riots that are happening in the South, which is what they wanted out of it, by the way. If you're Arthur or Lewis Tappan or Comstock and Andrews, you run to your warehouse, right? Your warehouse is on fire. These fine dry goods that you have, your whole livelihood is at stake, even if it's insured or not, and it would be insured, but we're going to get into that in a second as well. You're grabbing stuff out of your warehouse. Oh, over there, the fire's going this way, up there, that building, put it in that building. You run to put it in that building. By the time you get back to your warehouse, you turn around, that building's on fire. The merchant's house, the merchant's house. The merchant's exchange catches fire. This fine, supposedly impossible to destroy merchant's exchange with a beautiful glass rotunda catches with Alexander Hamilton's statue, the father of American commerce inside. It catches fire. In fact, there's a somewhat, I think, probably apocryphal story that somebody in the midst of this, there might have been a beautiful grand piano in the lobby or rotunda of this building, and somebody snuck in and played a funeral sonata on the piano. I think that is probably untrue, but it's a great New York, story at the same time for a harrowing night. Now, anybody who lived through 9/11, like myself, I was in Manhattan that day. I wasn't down where Ground Zero was, but you know what a hopeless scenario is like. This is at that level. If 9/11 never happened, this would be the worst natural thing that ever happened, or, worst, thing that ever happened in New York history. In fact, it's amazing that it's kind of forgotten. Eventually, they have to figure out, how are we going to stop this fire? Water won't do it, right? So the Brooklyn Navy Yard is across the river. Well, some men take boats and they go to the Brooklyn Navy Yard and they get explosives. On the way back, even though it's well below zero, with you can imagine the winds whipping on the water as they're trying to, just fight through the ice blocks that are there. Well, they have to take most of their clothes off and cover the explosive, because one wrong spark and bits of them are going to be everywhere, basically, for lack of a better way to say it. This fire is so bad, it could be seen in Poughkeepsie. It could be seen in Philadelphia, 90 miles away. Fire companies from those places send themselves to New York to try to help out. That's how bad this fire is. Eventually, here's how they stop this fire. Well, they don't stop the fire itself, but what they do is they realize the only way to stop this fire is to take these explosives and blow a hole big enough in Wall Street, and where Maiden Lane and between Maiden Lane and Wall Street, to allow this fire to not be able to advance any further. A pit, basically a fire pit. Nobody has the guts to do this. Eventually, Alexander Hamilton Jr. is the one that says, "Give me the charges, I'll do it." And he lights it, boom, blows it up. The fire doesn't advance any further. If they don't do that, all of New York City burns that night. And as it is, what quickly becomes known as the burn district is still on fire. I can't do this any kind of justice, right? Well, the official investigation, which takes a paltry 48 hours or so, rules it to be that a leaky gas valve near a lit coal stove inside the warehouse of Comstock and Andrews, north of Maiden Lane, is what causes the fire. Gas lighting had come in New York in the decade prior. It's a very flammable city, right? Okay. Now, here's my hypothesis. What if New York's greatest accidental fire was no accident? I know a great historian by the name of Daniel Levy, who wrote a book called The Great Fire of 1835, Manhattan, Phoenix, The Great Fire of 1835, and the Emergence of Modern New York. And this is the emergence of modern New York happens this night. Now, here's a map of Hanover Square in 1787. You're looking south. That would be Stone Street on your right and Pearl Street on your left. The larger building that's 3 stories there, that's where the India House is today. Right in front of it would have been a firehouse. Now, this is 1787. It's just a map to show you that north of that, you see these, if you see the map of Hanover Square in the vicinity to your right, you see D. Clarkson, and that's essentially where Comstock and Andrews is then. That's where the fire starts. I'm going to let that hang for a second, because I don't want to give away everything, right? Otherwise, I'm not a storyteller. But the birth of modern real estate is in this era. I think we would realize that. The Commissioner's Plan of 1811 establishes all the numbered streets and avenues. Further state allowances gave the city permission to expand the island further east and west using land excavated from grading Manhattan's topography. For those who don't know, the guy in charge of the Commissioner's Plan of 1811 has an office in Greenwich Village, and that's why Greenwich Village is saved, unlike, say, the Bowery Village, which the only remnants of it today are Stuyvesant Street, which once connected Peter Stuyvesant's main property to the Bowery. And I think if you look at the grid, you'll also see that Aster Place is part of that grid as well. As I mentioned earlier, I can't see anybody here, but I'm sure you all know New York history well enough to know the 19th century Manhattan is a giant construction site. Although the streets and avenues are being opened, their quality varies. For example, in 1829, it said that First Avenue is a dangerous road, nearly unpassable for carriages, especially in wet weather. In 1835, the city's Common Council decrees all gridded streets between 14th and 42nd Street to be open. Real estate is booming. In April of 1835, Francis B. Cutting and Robert Bayard sold the late William Bayard's country place at auction for $225,000. That's, even with more inflation, that's about $9 million today. It sold for less than $60,000 2 years prior. And keep in mind, next year after this, no federally backed currency. There are numerous examples of similar transactions. This is a map of New York in 1836. You see Washington Square. So as New York grows, widening and creating streets is paramount, obviously. It also raises property value, but this is very important. Property tax only increases when you improve the land. So if I have a plot of land somewhere north of say 42nd Street, in this case, modern 42nd Street, however many acres, and let's say it's just a plot of land, field, with it's worth $5,000 with a $50 tax assessment. I could sell that land to William for $500,000, make a $495,000 profit. Thank you, William, for being such a generous buyer. But if William takes that $500,000 plot of land that he just, now it's worth $500,000 technically, right? Because that's what he paid for it, and does nothing to it, it's a $500,000 plot of land with a $50 tax assessment. Flipping unimproved property is creating severe artificial inflation. New York as a government, which the official name of the government at this time is the Corporation of the City of New York. Well, the corporation is making this on real estate because land property tax only increases if you make improvements. So all of this land north of the city that's just there in the open field that people are buying and selling and flipping, New York is making nothing on it. Now, the individual members of the Common Council, what we call the City Council today, sure, they might be making a killing, but the coffers of the government, they're not making any money on it. While the next year, there will be no federally backed currency, and there's a stalemate hurting trade with France. Well, international trade because of a stalemate with France. And as I said, you have a port collector. Now, that's how New York makes most of its money at the time. So your port collector, Samuel Swartwood, is embezzling millions of dollars. That's not going to New York's coffers. So people are getting rich, individual citizens, while New York City gets none of the money. Philip Hone, noted diarist, Whig, former mayor, writes this in April of 1835 in his diary. Immense fortunes have been made and realized within the last 3 months. There must come a change, and when it does, woe to those who are caught. This distribution of property, however, by small lots will divide the losses when that evil day comes, aka when the economy collapses, and they will not be felt, these losses, in the same degree by any as the profits are by the few. So while everybody might get wiped out in this recession turned depression, those who made a killing will be okay. And and we're in the era of homes being built. Bond Street is one of the toniest areas of the city, Washington Square, St. John's Place, etc. And please do visit the Merchant's House, because though the Merchant's House and the houses on the north side of Washington Square Park, those are giving you an idea of what was the construction like at the time that was going up. Now let's talk about New York again, as far as, and by the way, I see people are commenting on the chat, and I'm going to answer all those things, comments and stuff at the end. People are flooding into New York City, as we mentioned. July 4th, 1827, Emancipation Day, slavery is totally outlawed. 30,000 people live on Manhattan Island in 1790, roughly 270,000 in 1835, 900,000 in 1860. That's the kind of growth we're seeing on Manhattan Island. Now, we think of the worst riot in New York City history. Go. The draft riots of 1863, correct? Well, between April of 1834 and February of 1837, there are 8 full-scale riots in New York in less than 3 years. We think of the labor movement as being something of the latter part of the century, and maybe really culminating in March of 1911 with the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. There are unions already, including the Global Trade Union and the Stonecutters Union. So take a look at this. In the same time as these riots, right? So there's 8 riots in less than 3 years. Well, in a little less than 2 years, you have 7 full-scale union strikes. A famous one would be NYU's first big Gothic building built in Washington Square Park, done using prison labor from Sing Sing, causes a riot and a strike because the Stonecutters Union not too happy about that, as you could imagine. Now let's talk about Lower Manhattan for a second. What we think of as the financial district today, the area that burnt down. Now, while New York is expanding up Manhattan Island, the Common Council is struggling to modernize the infrastructure of Lower Manhattan. How can city developers widen streets if business owners build right up to the property lines near streets? New buildings are being constructed using brick, but there are still several hundred wooden buildings in the area where the Great Fire took place. Also, the last vestiges of residential living down there, that once this fire happens, it's never a residential district again until the very end of the 20th century. Now, let's talk about that, right? So, like, let's say, William, you own a plot of land on the corner of Pearl Street and Conti's Slip, or, you know, that area. And you built right up to your lot line. And you have the eastern side, William, and I have the western side. And we both built up to the lot lines. And the city, you know, terms like gridlock I mentioned already exist. And so the Common Council brings us into a session and they say, look, we really need to modernize this infrastructure. We have to widen the street. Well, what is William going to say? Hey, wait a minute. Lop off 4 feet of James's building, not mine. I'm not going to rebuild my warehouse. So the city forefathers pulling their hair out. They don't know what to do because they can't get anything done down there. Most of the insurance companies are located in the burnt district, by the way. So let's say you're the Tappins, your building is destroyed. Well, guess what? The insurance company that you have the policy out with, they're destroyed too. That's a big SOL moment, right? Well, after the Great Fire, there's a giant meeting. And Philip Hone, who's a Whig, right? So he's not a member of the party that's in power. Well, they get him to go to Albany to ask the state for a loan of $6 million to pay the fire insurance companies back to help bail out the rest of the companies. By the way, that's what makes Hartford the insurance capital of the United States. Enterprising people from Hartford come, pitch in, help out, of course, also making money in the deal. Hone goes and gets this loan of $6 million, right? Well, at the same time, the city creates the fire loan stock of New York to get people to sell their land or fire bonds to the city. Think of it like a proto version of eminent domain. Now, the Common Council uses this, but they also use some of that $6 million to buy land north of 42nd Street so that the city will own land. In fact, the land known as the Common Lands, that is today's Central Park, bought in real estate deals following the Great Fire of 1835. So here's something else to put it in a different term. And they do meet, by the way, the $1 million payment that's due January 1st, 1836, they meet that payment, which was improbable just a month earlier. So the city of New York enters December of 1835, flat broke. What happens if January 1st, 1836 comes around and the citizens of New York say, well, you know, listen, and anybody else who wanted to put money into this project, the Croton project, that is, well, listen, we raised the first million by September of 1835, and we raised $700,000 for you by January 1st. It's only $300,000 more. Make up the difference, corporation. What's the corporation of the city of New York or the Common Council going to say? We can't. We can't make up the difference. We're bankrupt. So what's going to happen in that moment? Well, you're going to have a New York diaspora is what's going to happen. Because, well, the Croton project isn't going to get finished. So if I am a businessman or anybody living in New York with any means, let's go to Philadelphia, where they figured out, and I saw somebody, yes, cholera epidemics in 1832 and 34, and yes, they happen other places as well. I realize that, you know, it comes down from Montreal, Canada into New York, blah, blah, blah. But, and I'm not trying to downplay that, but the point is, these other cities are already cleaning themselves up in ways that New York isn't. Let's go there. Let's go to the burgeoning Detroit. Hey, New Orleans, that's a city that seems like the natural waterways of our country would make that the chief ideal city to be the chief city of the United States of America, not New York because of the Erie Canal. Let's go there. The point is, New York, poof, it dies. Of course, they do meet this payment, and then they meet the $500,000 payment in April of 1836, and the Croton project gets built, and it opens and the Croton Reservoir opens in 1842. Now, Stepan Allen, the Tammany Democrat man who is the representative at the Tammany the Democrat National Convention in 1835. He's a member of New York City's hospital board. He's the head of the Water and Fire Commission. He's the head of the Croton Project Commission. He's the New York City Democrat National Convention representative. He's the head of the Great Fire of 1835's investigative committee. Here's the official investigation, which takes a very short amount of time for a fire that destroys the whole financial district. This is what they say. And I mentioned this earlier, a leaky gas valve near a lit coal stove inside the warehouse of Comstock and Andrews causes this fire. Okay, well, let's say, William, your name isn't William at all. You're Comstock, and my name isn't James, it's Andrews. And our livelihood is sunk into a dry goods building where we sell fine dry goods, right? All right, so there might be a leaky gas valve. Gas lighting, notoriously leaky. But we know fire is a big problem, especially in a crowded area. So much so that arson is a capital crime. This fire starts on a Tuesday night at 9 o'clock in an area of the city that is no longer residential, i.e., Comstock and Andrews don't live at their warehouse. They live elsewhere. I don't think that a lit fire will be burning deep into the night when no one is there. So a leaky gas valve near a lit coal stove inside this warehouse starts the fire. By the way, this same man, Stepan Allen, who's the head of the investigative committee, he's also the head of the building. He's essentially head of the rebuilding committee afterwards. So he's the head of the Croton Project, the head of the investigative committee, the head of the rebuilding committee, and the head of the Water and Fire Commission simultaneously. Some other things, Washington Irving is in New York in 1835. He's staying at this moment with John Jacob Aster at his Hellgate estate, working on a biography. He has time to start the St. Nicholas Society. And here's a nice quote by him. Who ever heard of a fat man heading a riot or herding together in turbulent mobs? No, it's your lean, hungry men who are continuously worrying society and setting the whole community by the ears. To wrap up, should we ask Helen Jewett? She's an upscale 24-year-old courtesan enjoying a rare level of power for women in 1835. She has agency over her own life. She's willing to take men to court for unpaid debts. Gee, I wonder what those unpaid debts were in service of. And she isn't afraid to walk around New York City without the company of a man. It makes her the target for unstable men. Now, she has a client that turns into a boyfriend, a man named Richard Robinson. Now, remember, she's 24. He's only 18. That's very unusual for the time. Well, sometime in the early morning hours of April 10th, 1836, and I should say Helen and Richard, they're the reality TV's chief toxic couple of the day. It seemed like they were both blackmailing each other. She had some sort of brooch of his or a likeness. I forgot what it's called. Basically a bust, but something you'd wear. This is the era before photography, although photography does start. The first portrait is developed in 1839 in NYU, but that's a story for another day. But sometime in the early morning hours of April 10th, 1836, Helen Jewett is brutally murdered in her room at Regina Townsend's brothel, killed with 3 hatchet blows to the head, and then burned after the fact as a cover-up. The last person to see her alive was Richard Robinson because, well, it was his 19th birthday. So he's arrested. He seems relatively sociopathic about it. I don't know her. I don't know what you're talking about. I don't give a damn, blah, blah, blah. Well, he's let off because the judge, Ogden Edwards, now the judge is Ogden Edwards and the prosecutor is Ogden Hoffman. 2 Ogdens in the same place. There's a joke in there somewhere. But Judge Ogden Edwards, who's also, by the way, presiding over another trial going on at the same time that has to do with Stonecutter riots, instructs the jury to disregard all testimony from women who worked at the brothel unless substantiated by a male patron, i.e., these women are prostitutes. We can't believe a word they're going to say. Well, off the record, lots of men did say what happened that night, but nobody is going to go on the record and say that because how's that going to look at Trinity Church on Sunday? No male patron is willing to publicly admit anything, and Richard Robinson is let off. He leaves New York shortly thereafter. He dies a few decades later, and supposedly, once again, could be apocryphal, the last words on his lips are 2 words, Helen Jewett, whose real name was Dorcas Doyen, by the way. And I guess if I was going to be a lady of the evening, I would change my name from Dorcas Doyen to something else as well. just some production over stuff with the story that I did. Burning Gotham is obviously a story almost completely on true events. Its themes, self-identity, socioeconomic perseverance, race, religious, and gender relations are as relevant today as they were in 1835. The episodes are short, by the way, if you haven't listened to it. Burninggotham.com, anywhere you get a podcast, or at YouTube as well. Episodes are 10 to 15 minutes in length, like an old radio serial soap opera. Anyway, that's basically the end of my presentation. So let's get to some Q&A.
All right. Well, first, James, thank you
Yes.
so much for that incredible presentation. That was a blast. So, I mean, I want to
Quite
start the
literally,
Q&A
William, a blast on the night.
a blast. And I wish I did own all that New York City property that you kept mentioning throughout the presentation.
Sure.
All right. So you mentioned, though, that this is such an impactful event to the city's history, but it isn't very well known. Why do you think it's not so well known? And what led you to develop Burning Gotham? What led you to this interest in this specific period in the city's life?
Well, thank you for asking me that. Now, at the time that I started developing Burning Gotham, I was already doing documentaries in the history of U.S. network radio broadcasting. And I wanted to do a period piece set in New York history. I wasn't sure what to do. An initial idea, was maybe do Blizzard stories from 1888. You know, an anthology, you just have to, the only common theme would be that it takes place during the Great Blizzard of 1888. That aside, I was working in the area and was familiar with the fire. I went to where the fire started, and if I can pull up this map for a second, from 1787, because it'll make sense. Now, I don't know, can you see my cursor, William, or not?
Yeah, we can see
Oh,
it.
okay, great, because sometimes that's not possible. So if here's where the fire started, right? And I'm standing there looking south at Hanover Square, and I just said to myself, you know, William, if you came to me and said, hey, we want to do an arson, we want to burn the financial district down, what's the best place to start this fire on a cold, windy night in December to ensure it shoots off in as many directions as possible, as fast as possible? Now, I didn't know anything other than I did have a general working knowledge of New York history already. Being a native New Yorker who loves New York history, grew up in a house with my grandparents and great-grandparents being told about New York history. But without knowing any better, I said, you know, I'm standing there, and if you look south, you see Pearl Street, Stone Street. There's all these streets in the area, and if you started a fire right at this point, it would do what I just said, shoot off in as many directions as possible. My cat has the zoomies right now, by the way. I'm sorry. Stop. She's not going to listen to that. So, you know, hey, this fire could have started anywhere, but it just happened to start right there. So that was my inspiration to at least start doing some research. I didn't know anything about this era other than very, you know, top level stuff. Lo and behold, there is no smoking gun. But Stepan Allen does write this thing in his diary, the month of the fire. If our lives are spared, like what a strange thing to write in your diary the month that this happens. Then they changed the firefighter laws the week before the fire. The week after the fire, they changed the real estate laws. And they meet, you know, and the same guy is in charge of the same guy is the investigator. He's in charge of the Croton Project. He's the one saying if our lives are spared. And this is another thing. He is a man, Stepan Allen, that is in his 60s at this point. Well, about 15 years later, he's on a ship called the Henry Clay, a big old paddle wheel steamship, right? And the Henry Clay is a 3-decker, top deck, middle deck, bottom deck. Well, the middle deck catches fire. And so the pilot, the captain of the ship, grounds at the shore on a neighboring island. And if you're on the top deck, you could jump down to safety. You might break your leg. Gangrene might set in. That would be a horrible way to die, but at least it sure beats dying right now. Well, Stepan Allen dies in that fire. Or in that drowning, because if you ground the ship ashore, the bottom deck of the Henry Clay totally submerged in water, but the middle deck completely engulfed in flames. So this man obsessed with water and fire spends the last moments of his life deciding, will I burn alive or will I drown? You know, we can go on forever with this stuff. Very interesting karmic type stuff. To answer a couple of questions, The Livingston you mentioned early on, is he related to Robert R. from New York who signed the Declaration of Independence? Yes, absolutely. In fact, if we're going to play the all things are connected again, well, Regina Townsend's brothel, where Helen Jewett is murdered, the owner of that brothel is John Livingston, who is the brother of Edward Livingston, the minister to France. I don't necessarily think those two things are related, other than the fact that they are brothers, so they're related in that way. But are there any memorials or monuments to Stepan Allen? No, but there used to be a memorial to the Great Fire of 1835 that no longer exists today. I don't think I have it in this presentation, actually. It was on Pearl Street, the section of Pearl Street down by Hanover Square, where buildings. So if you want to go see the greatest living, monument to the Great Fire of 1835, go to Stone Street, the area of Stone Street where the restaurants are today, because all of those buildings, almost all of them, not all of them, but almost all of them, were all built directly after the fire. They're all buildings built in 1836 and 1837. And when you go there, look at Stone Street, look at Pearl Street down there by Conte's Alley, and notice how narrow that street is. Remember, they widened the street to be that in 1836 after this fire. So you can imagine how narrow the streets would be prior to that. And by the way, the fire of 1835, well, William, you own the plot of land on one side of that street, and I own the plot of land on the other, and none of us wants to lop off 4 feet of our buildings to widen the street. Gee, well, if we burn everything down, that kind of gives us a blank slate to do what we need to do. Jeffrey, isn't it reasonable that a stove may have kept stowed in Comstock as the weather was so very cold and perhaps it was required to keep some products from freezing? That is a reasonable question to ask. I cannot prove you are right or I am right, but I think knowing the amount of fires, if nobody was tending to that fire and watching, like a night watchman, yes, it's reasonable if there was a night watchman. So could this have been an accident? Right, it could have been. Very much could have been an accident, and then all this stuff happens at a convenience afterwards. But I have no smoking gun. There's no way to prove that, other than that, a little thing like if our lives are spared and some karma stuff, that's what makes for great drama, as opposed to, Daniel's book, Daniel Levy, where, he disagrees with me very openly about that. And I can't say I blame him. But I'm a storyteller, and, cui bono. So anyway.
What do you feel for yourself and all the research that you've done is really the most impactful legacy of the fire and the events the period that followed? What do you feel still has an impact on us New Yorkers today?
Well, as Daniel Levy's book is titled Manhattan Phoenix, The Great Fire of 1835 and the Emergence of Modern New York, that is absolutely correct. If this fire does not happen, the city of New York would not have met that January 1st payment, and they would not have been able to build the Croton Aqueduct because of it. So you have the Croton Aqueduct come out of this fire, which brings clean water to New York, opening in 1842. Because, by the way, hey, it would be really great if there was an aqueduct with a lot of running water to make sure that if there's a fire this bad again, we can put it out. But also Central Park comes from this as well, because those land deals, the city gets in on the real estate game in the 1830s, the later part of the 1830s after this fire. So this fire and this wild, wild year, everything that I've said here today happens between April of 1835 and April of 1836. From the election, which they say we're going to build the Croton Aqueduct, to Helen Jewett's murder. It all happens in everything in 12 months. That 12-month period is probably the most monumental 12-month period in New York history. Why is it forgotten? Well, I think there's a lot of reasons. For one, I mentioned early on, hey, in 1790, roughly 30,000 people are living on Manhattan Island. In 1860, 900,000 people are living on Manhattan Island. That's unprecedented growth. I think the only way to do any kind of piece like this would be to do it the way Burroughs and Wallace did it, where Gotham is the greatest tome on the history of New York ever. Or, in this case, what I did with my writing partner, Olga, we dove in and I've read 200 books on this era, and stopped myself. Like, if it takes place after 1850, I don't want to know about it. I don't need a telegraph accidentally coming into this, so, I do think it's this whole thing is the most important thing to happen in New York in the 19th century. because without it, there is no New York going forward. So there are no draft riots. There is no Gilded Age.
Well, this has been an incredible story. And if there are no more questions from the audience, we will wrap it up here. And just to say a really big thank you, James, for this great presentation. We could feel your passion coming through the screen here.
Oh, thank
So
you.
folks, please go out and check James's website, go on one of his walking tours, check out Burning Gotham, and listen to those fantastic programs. We thank all of you for joining us this evening. And another big thank you to you, James. Really appreciate this.
Yeah, may I say a couple of more things really quickly?
Sure.
Thank you. So I'm just putting my link tree in the chat because I actually have a walking tour this weekend. I do walking tours of Lower Manhattan, basically the site-specific version of what you've heard today. So if you're that interested still and want to see me in person, you can come on that. I also do tours for other companies, including Boroughs of the Dead, great Andrea Janes and Boroughs of the Dead. And I'm doing a Greenwich Village Ghost Tour, Central Greenwich Village Ghost Tour, Saturday night. So there's that. Now you can listen to Burning Gotham at burninggotham.com, anywhere you get a podcast. If you're interested in listening to my shows on my docu-podcast in the history of American network radio broadcasting, this month I just did an episode on Jack Benny in 1944. I know more about radio history than I know about New York history. And so, because, I'm a terrible friend. I don't go out much. I always direct people to my YouTube channel to listen to those podcasts. They're available anywhere you get a podcast, but I always say YouTube because it's the easiest path to monetization. And by the way, I self-produced the first 8 episodes of Burning Gotham. I have 22 more totally written, unproduced episodes, and story totally written for 15 more after that. So, it's about continuing to push this stuff forward. And I don't need it. I don't need Burning Gotham on my tombstone, but I would love to do more episodes at some point.
Amazing. Well, terrible friend, but a great storyteller. So we appreciate all the work that you've done. So thank you again. This has been a lot of fun.
Yes, thank you. And anybody, if you want to send me an email, here's my email address, james@thewallbreakers.com. I'm happy to send you a PDF of this presentation, etc. And William, great to see you. Glad that you're doing well. And, this was a lot. Thank you for giving me this platform this evening.
Absolutely. And we'll include James's email and links in the follow-up message that will be sent out and probably early next week. So if you do miss it here in the chat, don't worry, we will include it in the follow-up message that we'll send out. So thank you, everyone. Have a great night. Thank you, James. Also good to see you again.
Thank you, sir. And thank you, everybody, for attending, for your great questions. I like the questions because it makes me jog my memory even more. So, and thank you to the Salmagundi Club, which I am very much a member of. And thank you to the Merchants House Museum, whom I know as well. And if you want to see what somebody would have lived in 1835, please go visit the Merchants House. It's 1832, lovely townhouse. You know where it is, I'd assume, if you're on this chat right now. So
yeah, please definitely go check out the Merchants House. They can definitely use all the support that we can help muster for them. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, James. Have a great night.
thank you, everybody. Take care.